We're with Nadeen Ibrahim, and she is one amazing community organizer and activist. And hopefully by the end of the evening, we'll understand what it takes to get to where she's at. To give her a brief introduction, she completed her master's thesis on how the Israeli government weaponized a variety of land policies to increase and fund settlement construction. And so this is a way of changing the demographics of Palestinian lands. And but she's also a seasoned community organizer with several years of experience. She's organized Palestinian, Muslim, immigrant, and refugee communities. And some of her flagship projects include co-founding the Colorado Muslim Leadership Council and Denver Day of Dignity and Muslim Youth Empowerment Conference. And so she has this unwavering commitment to advocating for Palestine and Palestinians, and it's driven by her identity. She was born in Jerusalem during the Oslo Accords. Sorry to date you here, maybe. But maintains a deep connection with her family and land in Palestine. And so we'll be learning about some of her experiences being an activist in the world, her master's in public policy at the University of Oxford in England, and how how she feels as an activist going forward. One of the main issues that we have here is that we find ourselves in sort of a lockdown. Politically, the Palestinians are caught between one set of conditions that say that there is not going to be a two-state, and there is no interest in driving further peace talks. And on the other, there's a demand that the occupation be over with. If you saw Mahmoud Abbas's address to the United Nations, we have 1 year to end it. So there seems to be a gap between the two. So anyway, I'll let Nadeen begin with just some of her background. Give me the big picture on how you got to where you are now.
Before we do that, let's officially introduce our program tonight. So we wanted to just welcome everybody to the latest installment of our interview series that the Colorado Center for Freedom and Justice is conducting. And we call ourselves CFJ-Colorado. We're a nonprofit based out of Denver, Colorado. And our mission is to provide education about and support for the town of Beit Umar, which is in the West Bank. My name is Jennifer. I'm a member of CFJ-Colorado. We do have a couple housekeeping items for tonight. So be sure to note our website address in the banner at the bottom of your screen, as well as our contact information. And feel free to email or write us to be added to our contact list. One really exciting thing is that our group recently released a newsletter. And in that newsletter, we talk about some fundraising that we're doing for Beit Umar. They are organizing a women's outdoor market to help the folks there be more sustainable with agriculture, with food, and really to support women. So if you're able to, we'd ask that you check out the links in the newsletter and on the website and possibly consider donating to that cause. So for our interview tonight, it will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. For the Q&A, you can use the chat features on either YouTube or Facebook, depending where you are, though we encourage you to hold off on posting chats or questions until that Q&A comes up. And tonight we have our interviewer, Sergio Atala, and he is a member of our CFJ group. And so I will turn it back over to him. Really excited to hear the great questions that he has for Nadeen tonight. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thanks for the housekeeping. I got the small detail. Anyway, so why don't you start, Nadeen, with some of your background? I'd like to know what made you an activist for Palestine.
Yeah, so I, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you. And for the Muslims that might be part of the conversation here tonight, assalamu alaikum to all of you. when your question is a very unique one, and I really like to start with my name, because from the moment that I was brought into this earth, I was really, it was that moment that started that spirit and that fiery passion for activism, largely driven by my Palestinian identity. And so with that, I always really like to remind people of like where I come from and who I am, because those are really intrinsic to a lot of the passion and motivation that I have for the variety of activism I engage in. And so my name is Nadeen Ibrahim. Now, the reason why I share that name is because that name shares my lineage and it shares my connection to Palestine. A connection to Palestine that has been documented for more than 700 years. In fact, the very structures of where my dad's tribe started, the Karaja tribe, which is the last name that I mentioned in that group, was in Deir Zia. It's right outside of Ramallah, and it's been there for over 700 years, very well documented, and my dad is in the process of restoring a lot of those old structures to maintain their integrity. My name, the second name in my name, Mu'tasim, is my dad's name. And so being Palestinian, your name a lot of times tells who you are, meaning like which families you're coming from, but also because families historically are part of certain geographic areas, by default, you can tell also where they're from in Palestine. So in the Karaja tribe, you can definitely tell that we're from outside of Ramallah and Deir Zia. And then the other two names in there are for my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And then the name Ibrahim, which is what is perceived to be my last name in the American style of naming, is the sub-name of the one of the families within the Karaja tribe. And so the reason why I really like to start off with that is that's really who makes me who I am. From the day that my parents named me Nadeen, I knew I was to have a very fiery attitude and to not take no for an answer, not to shy away from speaking out openly. And because of the existence of my people solely rests on us existing and us manifesting who we are as Palestinians, that really drives a lot of who I am. And so from a very young age, I knew that I was Palestinian. I knew what it meant to be Palestinian, and I knew that I needed to make a commitment to my people and my identity and their quest for sovereignty. So that's where a lot of it comes from. I think over the years, I've also had the pleasure of being mentored by a number of people whom are very well known in the activist sphere, who've helped me identify where my privileges are, who've helped me take what my identities and learn how to attach power to that in order to drive change. And in addition to that, just really reading and just trying to stay informed as much as possible has been a lot. But also my connection to Palestine is what drives it. Every time I try to go to my motherland and I see the level of occupation present itself, and how the occupying force repeatedly trying to make us seem like we're foreigners, it further just brings me back and tells me like I need to try harder, I need to do more.
So do you think that you need to go to Palestine in order to sort of get it, to really understand the level of oppression? And you can read about it, but how do you think that perhaps your awareness of your travels throughout the world, you've been in Europe, in Asia, and in many other places, how does that influence or educate you in your activism?
Yeah, certainly. I think, I need to go to Palestine because I need to maintain a connection to my people. I have the ability to go to Palestine, and so I am going to take every opportunity I can. More than 99% of my family still resides there. So for me, that's deeply personal. I don't think you need to go to Palestine at all in order for you to understand the extent of occupation, an occupation that we are funding as Americans, that are taxpayers. And so that makes us complicit to the American foreign policies in the area, which means that if we are not okay with it, That means that we need to engage in the activism in order to change that narrative and to change those policies. But I really like to share, I really love for people to visit Palestine because the way that I see it is the Israeli government tries to prevent people from going there, to really prevent them from the ability to really see the level of the military occupation that the Palestinians live under. And that's why I tell people, if you have the opportunity to visit, you should visit and have a Palestinian be your guide. Because I can tell you that there's restriction of movement. I can tell you that there are military checkpoints. I can tell you that the settlements have completely divided Palestinian society, that there are different roads that Palestinians have to drive on compared to Israeli settlers, roads that are much horrible in condition, that at any point in time, the Israeli occupying force can come knock down your door. I can tell you all of that, but as Americans, I don't think we really understand the weight of that until we actually see it display itself. And that's when you could really understand the level of the occupation. And it's those powerful narratives that you gain from people that are living there, that are telling you how they're living day to day, that I think will drive even more activism. So I support programming that CFJ-JP as well as others have been part of here in Colorado, where they try to bring Palestinians into Colorado to share their narratives, to hear it directly from them. That adds a bit of personalization to the experiences of Palestinians that are living under the occupation, one that's beyond the statistics.
So yeah, but it's obvious that most people won't be able to travel to Palestine. So what are the blocks that they typically encounter if they want to understand the Palestinian cause here in the States?
What, I'm sorry, can you repeat that
question?
Yeah,
what would be the blocks for an American that an American would experience in trying to understand the Palestinian cause? I mean, if you're not able to travel to Palestine and see with your own eyes the level of oppression that there is, and what are your options? How are you going to get informed?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's Palestinians like myself that don't live too far away from you. There are organizations of allies and Palestinians that are celebrating Palestinian culture in order to ensure its existence, that are continuously exploring ways to leverage American privilege in order to drive change in support of Palestinian advocacy. So I would highly recommend that people join organizations like CFJ, as well as the Colorado Palestine Club that was founded by Palestinians, in order to understand more who the Palestinians are, but also to have an opportunity to be able to give back and to join the advocacy efforts. There's the power of books. I mean, I don't need to say that to anybody, that the power of books are literally there. There are Palestinians, poetry, books, like pure first facts, primary facts that people can read. There's also Jewish authors that recognized early on just the level of violence that was being committed in the name of Judaism and self-determination of the Jewish people against the Palestinians, that have taken to writing books and really and very much so characterizing that as well. You can read the Human Rights Watch reports. You can read many different articles and publications by the United Nations that are telling you what's going on there. The information is so accessible, right? The thing is, it's not so mainstream in the United States. What's mainstream in the United States is this continued narrative to paint Palestinians as the bad guys and the Israelis as the poor victims that need continued military funding and support from the U.S. government. And so it's a massive lobbying group. It's like several $1 million strong. So sure, that's probably what we see on our media, but if we're a little bit more intentional about our engagement and how we move about things and like actually questioning what it is that is being given to us by mainstream media, then we'll be able to really delve into the truth of what's really going on there. And so yes, the reading materials are there. They'll perfectly paint the picture of what is going on there. to the extent that it should convince any person that reads it that what's going on to the Palestinian people is not right, and that by living here with the United States, we have a direct role to play in changing the narrative around that and really supporting the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination.
Yeah, I guess I was not surprised to not hear words like New York Times or NPR or CBS News.
Right.
Yeah, this is the mainstream media that does not really provide a fair and balanced reporting, unfortunately. So I'm glad you're here. So, which,
Yeah.
by the way, I should also add a little.
Right, and that's why most recently, what we saw is for the first time, we saw a contender to the mainstream media, and that was social media, where Hamad al-Kurd and his sister Mana al-Kurd, who were named part of Time's 100 most influential people most recently, literally rose to great levels. What is going on in Sheikh Jarrah? They brought Palestinian advocacy and the need for Palestinian advocacy and centered it in a international social media platform where everyone was talking about it within the span of a week. And I was literally getting messages every single day from friends that I never even knew, even understood what the term Palestinian meant, that were like, we want to learn more. We're sorry what's happening to your people. We want to learn more and we want to be more engaged. And so, you know, we are seeing a new form of Palestinian advocacy that's starting to present itself, that's starting to unify itself internationally. That's unlike what we've seen in the past. And it's really reassuring to see that. And it's also really invigorating as well.
Yeah, this phenomenon of Sheikh Jarrah, it really focuses on one very specific area, which is house expropriation, house demolition. But there are so many areas that you can go into when you're talking about activism in Palestine. And there are so many areas of human rights abuses that turn out. Do you have any strategy as an activist that you prefer one area or another? I know that your master's focused on the issue of settlements. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your strategy would be at this point in time? It seems that settlements are being driven with impunity, and there is money poured into them that we were actually pouring money into it. But why don't you talk a little bit about what would you believe might be the most effective avenue among the many to combat the oppression of the Palestinians?
Mm-hmm. So I think in general, in any form of activism, the centering has to be on the oppressed voices. So you can't talk about Palestinian advocacy without having Palestinian voices at the center, right? Because they are the ones that are directly affected. They already have voices that have either been overlooked or not considered, just given the way that the systemic injustice has presented itself. And so I think first and foremost, it's always to center the voice, right? I can speak about Palestinian advocacy because I'm Palestinian, and I can speak straight from the heart because my people are impacted by that every day. My sheer identity has been impacted by that. My family has been impacted by that. So I will speak first and foremost about that because I'm directly related to that. That's directly a part of me. But for example, if I'm talking about other issues such as like refugee resettlement in the United States, or police brutality, primarily in the Black communities within the United States, I can't speak firsthand on that because I don't share those identities. So what I can do is see what social network privileges I have, where I know I have people that trust my voice, that are always looking to me for guidance or engagement. What I can make sure is I can bring in those voices and be like, this is who you need to be listening to. This is who's driving this change. This is who's directly impacted by it. So what I'm So with that being said, my thing around activism is really to be centered on what Palestinian voices, like I mentioned. And so with that being said, what I like to do is I talk about matters of settlements. And the reason why settlements are something that I deeply talk about is because my dad's town is threatened by a settlement. The sheer existence of the fields that my family has planted pomegranate trees, lemon trees, orange trees, olive trees for hundreds of years can be taken away from them at any point in time because it turned out to be labeled as partly Area C, right south of the Dolev camp. And when you take a look at the Israeli government, you see that the Dolev settlement has plans to take over that land. When is the question at hand. And so because of that, that's something that deeply impacts me, that deeply threatens the existence of my people and what they know as true to who they are. That's something that I'm going to talk about a lot. Mohammed al-Kurd and Muna al-Kurd, they knew Sheikh Jarrah the best because Sheikh Jarrah is where they lived. It's where their family has lived for generations. It's where they escaped to after 1967 war, where they were promised that they could live there in peace and never be told to leave. And only to find out that in 2020 that they would be told that they need to leave and have eviction orders set to them by the Israeli Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that is neither selected by the Palestinian people or the Palestinian people have no voice in. So for me, I believe in the power of storytelling and narratives. For example, we take a look at Malala. Malala has rose to being a huge advocate for women's education, but she's only one of several girls that are from her town that experienced the same fate as she did. But we remember her voice and we remember the advocacy that she is part of because her story is so deeply personal. And I think we as humans, we build connections more by those connections being a little bit more interpersonal and knowing one another a little bit on a deeper level. And so I believe in the power of storytelling and narratives in really igniting activism and bringing people to the table. And then once we have people there, it's then a different conversation to see what are the different skill sets that we have and how can we all work as a collective power in order to drive the change that we aim to seek because at the end of the day, we all have spheres of influence. And the sphere of influence that I have is very different than the sphere of influence that you have, Sergio. So you can motivate a certain group of people to be towards Palestinian advocacy, and I can motivate a certain group of people towards Palestinian advocacy. And together, we can have a much larger group.
So, yeah, I would personally love to motivate the Jewish community actually into educating them into a different narrative. And that is a challenge that I have set for myself. It's going to take a few more decades. But in the issue of education, in fact, how would you say it's possible to introduce the Palestinian narrative when the world is just so diverted by so many crises? The climate change, the political and social upheavals everywhere, and when is Palestine going to be an issue that will grab people's attention at a political level? I know that what you mentioned, the Time magazine article on the 100 most important people during the year, that was surprising. But I don't know if that has any bearing on policy making. And my question is, do we need to educate perhaps the Jewish community first before it becomes policy? What do we have to do to get a change of policy?
Yeah, those are really big questions that I think we ask ourselves so many times.
But you're the one with the master's in public policy.
Oh my gosh.
I feel entirely entitled.
And even that question in itself that's a really big question. I mean, I take a look at in terms of the first part of what you were talking about was we're constantly grabbed, right, by media's attention of crises that are happening all over the world. And while a lot of those crises only get 2 weeks of airtime, they are lasting for decades on end. That's a really difficult question, because I can't say that the Palestinian cause is more dire than climate change, or that the Palestinian cause is a more dire need than what's happening right now in Afghanistan, or what's happening to people in Tigray, or to what's happening, any part of the world, or the different issues that people are going through, right? I can't say that this issue is the one to go behind and the others need to take a backseat. I can never say that, and I never will say that. For me, Palestinian advocacy is first and foremost, because I directly see the threat that it has on the existence of my people. And so for me, that makes it a paramount issue for who I am. And sure, I will talk to other people and hope that they could see the need to express advocacy and allyship with the Palestinian cause. So it's really hard to kind of but I think within that, for example, you can identify intersectionality, right? So a big conversation that we were having in the Palestinian community after the live murder of George Floyd was the fact that a lot of officers within the United States receive training in some capacity by the IDF or former IDF members. And that's directly impacting members of our community here in the United States. That doesn't mean I need to be like Palestinian advocacy, this and this and that. But what I can do is I can aim for a small win for the Palestinian people, which is to have the United States law enforcement understand that they should not be exchanging tactics with an occupying occupying Israeli force like that of the IDF, and that they should cut off all relations. And just being able to cut off those relations will bring a bit of scrutiny to that Israeli Defense Force, in the hopes that by seeing that the American people in general will feel a bit more empathetic towards the Palestinian people and actually maybe start reconsidering their policies around it. Mm-hmm. So, and that's a bit of intersectionality that we identified. I think a lot of our causes are intersectional in many different ways. And I think if we can identify where those points of intersection are, we can learn how to build that collective power together. Because I really believe in the power of people. And I think the more people that come together to make change, the more possible change is to happen. And so that's what I really aim for. I aim to be part of movements, because it is movements that brought us the Human Rights Convention that we see today. It is international movements that brought us the conversations that we're currently having now about climate change. Right. It's international movements that have brought to light, in some respects, the Palestinian advocacy that is much needed. So I think it's really building on that's really needed, and it's my hope that more and more people will recognize that. And
you bring up the point of intersectionality and how it can eventually address the Palestinian issue. And my question to you is, well, there seems to be a trend towards progressivism, the simple understanding of the challenges that we're facing, and not being as committed to support the entities and institutions that have driven us to the state we're in. I often hear the term progressive except for Palestine. And I don't know if this is something that intersectionality might eventually overcome, but I do see a lot of progressive people that they will not touch the issue of Palestine. Why do you think that might be?
When it comes to progressives and the issue of Palestine, yes, I do agree with you. And even as a Muslim woman, I experienced that. Progressives are like, oh yes, we're for everything except religious freedom. And we'll still think that women who wear hijabs like myself are oppressed, or their dads force them to do it, which both of them are not true. I will also see them say that we are progressives, except on the matter of Palestine, to the extent that they will not even talk about it or acknowledge it in any capacity. Or for some of them that do identify as progressives, they come out with the standard one-liner where they're like, we support Israel's right to self-defense. And that's pretty much what you usually get in the political sphere of things when the conversations around the progressives and the Palestinians. I think what really needs to happen is there needs to be very intentional dialogue in that criticizing an occupying force like the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli government does not mean that you are attacking the Jewish people and Judaism. And that distinction needs to be drawn. Attacking a government and how a government is acting is not the same as attacking a people. And I think once Americans can understand that distinction, will they be open to have a very frank, open dialogue about the fact that what the Israeli government is doing and how we're enabling them to do that and literally protecting them to do that is not in the values that we hold as people here living within the United States. And that's, I think, when we could really start seeing.
Well, you touched the issue of what the IDF is doing. And it brought to mind Naftali Bennett. He's currently the Prime Minister of Israel. At one time, he was the Education Minister. And he forbid the group breaking the silence from being invited to speak to any venue. And so this is a decree that essentially, from an Israeli standpoint, they put essentially a gag order on the abuses of the IDF on the occupied territories. And well, as you well know, the US, as far as Middle East policy goes, they typically look towards Israel. What kind of education can we expect if Israel itself is denying the Palestinian narrative, is disabling the possibility of Israelis themselves learning about it? Can we expect that the US can separate itself from the habits that Israelis have been building in terms of their own very comfortable narrative?
I honestly, that's really another big question in itself. But I think what was a silver lining was seeing how literally the social media storm that was created around Sheikh Jarrah was making the very lobbying groups that are extremely pro-Israeli and that push for that agenda here in the United States start to feel uncomfortable and freak out a bit and look at wanting the certain politicians to come out saying certain statements as we saw them presenting. So I think, we shouldn't wait on a government force to be the one that's willing to shift narratives. I think there's other areas where we could be part of in order to shift those narratives, in order to have those conversations. And I think that in itself can really trump any type of government force. I think in my master's project, I thought as a Palestinian before that the Israeli people were, pretty much all on the same line of thinking about how they think about things. And in the course of doing interviews, of reading books from people that I would never read from, honestly, as a Palestinian, because I wanted to see what the other perspective was, that being the Israeli perspective, the very same people that are enabling the occupation of Palestinians. I've been able to see that they have diversity in how they perceive things as well. And that there's a lot of things within that that I think that we could capitalize on as Palestinians and Palestinian advocates that would allow us to change the narrative a bit and showcase a bit of the reality that's happening on the ground over there. Mm-hmm. And I think
I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, even the Jews in the U.S., most of Jews, do support the notion of questioning Israel's policies in the occupied territories. And they go as far as supporting the notion of reducing or conditioning the aid that Israel receives in accordance to how they conduct their policies. So, but here we're talking about appealing essentially to the values, and you mentioned values before, appealing to perhaps the core of humanity that we share as humans that we are. And my thought is, how does this appeal to the core of humanity confront the reality of AIPAC and funding groups that maintain a certain policy in the Foreign Affairs Committee, in the Senate? How do we then disable the money issue, the finances that come into play that maintain the policies as they are?
I think money is definitely always an issue, and unfortunately in many spaces money does speak power and does mean power. But I honestly think that if the people come together and that there is a massive collective movement that is unwavered for their support to the Palestinian people, that will overcome any type of money question. Because sure, AIPAC might have the money, but where do the votes lie? At the end of the day, if those politicians see that the vast majority of their constituents are leaning a particular way, it doesn't matter how much money they have inside their pocket, because at the end of the day, if they can't secure the votes, they're out of seat. And so I think if people just remember that at the end of the day, that the power lies within the voting population, then they would be able to rally behind that and understand how building a collective power around that can make sure that money can't talk in those spaces.
So where do you see the future of activism for Palestinian or for someone who supports the Palestinian cause? Let me give you the background here in terms of the big picture. Here we have an entire world that recognizes, or that, well, at least they claim that the two-state solution is the only way forward, including the United States. On the other hand, we have Israel that, with Naftali Bennett, that absolutely refuses to even consider a Palestinian state. It refuses to even consider peace talks. So what's left? We're in the middle here, and on the one side, we have policies that on the ground are gearing towards more and more settlements. But on the other hand, we have a world that's saying, no, let's go for a two-state solution. And so these two don't coincide. I'm a bit lost in terms of how to set my efforts and drive my activism. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share on that respect.
Those two perspectives do dominate a lot of the conversations when we talk about Palestinian advocacy, for sure. And it's very difficult to figure out where to exactly line around that. And the way that I think about it is, I'm a Palestinian living as part of the diaspora outside of Palestine, right? I would lend the voice of how the politics should be played out by the Palestinian people that are living under the occupation in Palestine. And so that's who I would look to for leadership around that. The Palestinian people have always been vying for self-determination and their own sense of sovereignty. And that's very intrinsic to who we are. And that is something that we want. And that is something that we should be entitled to, because we were given those promises over and over again. A number of failed promises, and even the world collectively under the United Nations recognizes that they failed us in that promise. And the fact that we still have the United Nations Work and Relief Agency, the UNRWA, that exists that helps the over 6 million Palestinian refugees that do not hold any citizenship in any other country because they were still promised a right to return to Palestine. That's who I would lend the voice to on figuring out really a lot of the politics around that. I think what Palestinian advocates and advocates for Palestinians outside of the territories can do is not be so fixated on what the political solution is, but on what do the people there immediately need. There needs to be an end to the checkpoints. There needs to be the free movement of people. There needs to be the ability of people to leave their town to visit Jerusalem without needing to go through a checkpoint or ask for a visa by the very occupying force that prevents them from entering it in the first place. There needs to be the ability of them to sleep comfortably in their homes, knowing that the military is not going to come knock down their door and take their children just because they need to question them. They need to be able to know that they can keep their lands, that their lands are not threatened in any way. So I think that's where a lot of our advocacy could really lie. I think a lot of times when we talk about Palestine and the Palestinian people, it's always like, what's your solution to the conflict? What's your solution to the conflict? And I'm like, even before you get to that conversation, first of all, it's not a conflict. We're talking about the occupation of a people that were there before the existence of the very state that's occupying them. And so talk about what those people are experiencing under occupation and how that occupation needs to end first before you come ask me about a solution to the geopolitical dynamics of what you're trying to get at. So that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the fact that my cousins, several of the young men were picked up at the ages of 14 and 15 and thrown into solitary confinement because they were being questioned as to whether or not they were part of some sort of conspired thing that the Israeli government was telling them that they're part of, right? That's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about their mental health and their well-being. I'm concerned about my relatives, all of them that are living under occupation, not able to visit Jerusalem and pray in Masjid al-Aqsa because they have to wait until they reach a certain age or that the Israeli government is willing to give them a permit to go there. I'm concerned about the fact that my dad's side of the family, whom have historically been farmers for centuries, have had so much of their land confiscated or rezoned that they do not have the ability to continue in carrying out the very things that made them who they are, as we call them fallahin, or villagers that were all about tolling the fields. I care about, the Palestinian culture that the Israeli government keeps trying to relabel as Israeli, including down to the very dress that we wear. I literally saw Israeli programming here in the US, here in Colorado, where the person is wearing the kufiya and saying that's part of the Israeli identity, when this is in its essence, Palestinian advocacy and resistance to the core. So when I'm talking about Palestinian advocacy and what we should be advocating for, I'm talking about the people that are living under occupation, what they need. I'm talking about the refugees that don't have citizenship in these other countries, that are sitting in limbo, waiting for their right to return or waiting for the ability to have access to proper food, water, healthcare. Talking about Gaza, that has been under siege for almost a decade now, and nobody is saying anything about that. And for how the life expectancy of people there has greatly decreased because of the sheer conditions that they live under. That's what we should be talking about. And then once we can provide that ability, we give the opportunity for the people to thrive and for them to decide their own fate and how they want their own country to be and how they want their own sovereignty to display itself.
Well, in reference to what you're saying, in fact, there is a political initiative that Betty McCollum started. I don't know if you're probably familiar with HR 2590, that speaks to precisely a lot of what you're saying, which are the needs of the people. The curtailment of, or the understanding or the monitoring of where our money goes, our tax money goes, And as I understand it, it is to make sure that it does not go towards the increase of settlement activity. And it's in the protection of children under detention as well. I don't know if you can speak a little bit. In fact, if Jennifer can put in the chat box some information on HR 2590 so that people can call their congressman and have the Congress support this initiative, because you're right. This is a trap that we have, that sometimes we end up talking about one state or two states, and it's really a nonsense. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's a conversation that bifurcates, or it goes around the needs of the people.
Right. I completely agree. And the very policy, the very piece of legislation that is proposed that you're referencing has been huge in really ensuring accountability of the U.S. government around the fact that we're giving military aid in order to further encourage practices that we have also said are against standard and the most basic human rights. So for me, it's a no-brainer that we would be passing that legislation. But unfortunately, because of the huge lobbying efforts, any type of legislation that puts any type of framework for criteria on the Israeli government and the aid that's given to it is all of a sudden seen as like impacting the Israeli government in a negative way. We're not supposed to engage in it as Americans, which should not be the case at all. So I do call on people. We've been calling on people since a lot of the largest rises in protesting this year, April, May period, calling on people to support, to call on their congressional representatives to lend support to HR 2590 and call for at least like the most basic conditioning on military aid to the Israeli government. Conditioning that we've placed on all other countries. It's not single out Israelis, the Israeli government anyway. We've done this type of conditioning for many other governments. And actually the only one that does not have any type of conditions on the aid that they receive from the US is actually the Israeli government.
Yeah, in fact, I see on the comments box that we've already placed the Nadeen Collins bill. So I would encourage the listeners to link on that bill and call. In fact, perhaps this is a good time to look at the questions that we have. One of them says, please comment on laws preventing support for BDS. That's something we don't talk much about either.
I'm sorry, can you please repeat that?
Yeah, the question is, please comment on laws preventing support for BDS. So this is the law
yes.
that several states have implemented that will boycott whatever institution calls for restricting the funding towards institutions that are in the West Bank as illegal settlements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a lot of, compared to other Western democracies, it's very interesting how the United States tries to continuously attack the Palestinian BDS movement. Colorado itself passed a piece of legislation, I don't remember when, it was like almost, I think like 4 or 5 years ago, where if there are any companies that are openly engaging in BDS, that they will no longer be able to participate in the retirement agency of PARA, and that would give PARA the authority to pretty much kick those companies out from participating should they choose to participate in any type of BDS against the Israeli government. So yes, there's a strong attack on BDS here in the United States. And a lot of those attacks have been illustrated through the very state legislation that we're seeing in different parts of the United States. BDS is a very unique movement in many different ways. So it's very complex, I think, in many ways, and it just depends on really who you talk about. It doesn't have much economic influence on the Israeli economy as people would think, but what it does is it creates that type of general conversation and advocacy that scares the lobbying groups that are pro-Israeli and makes them question the level of traction that the BDS movement might be getting in terms of support.
And another question we have is, what areas of struggle, tactics, issues, campaigns, etc., do you think the pro-Palestinian community in Denver and Colorado ought to pursue most immediately?
Ooh. That's a good question. Let's see here. I think the biggest topic that's been for a lot of Palestinians right now is the current eviction orders that many Palestinians in CFJ-Colorado, in Sinwan, and in surrounding areas are receiving. And so there is definitely a vested interest of a lot of the Palestinian people here in trying to explore ways to make sure that Palestinians can stay housed in their homes, that they will not be forced to destroy their homes, leave their homes, or in many ways have to destroy their own homes. So I would say like that's probably like one of the most pertinent issues. Another one is, I would say, is the torture that political prisoners are experiencing. I'm sure maybe many of you have heard about how miraculously 6 Palestinian prisoners that have been in jail, been in Israeli prison and detention for over 15 years, managed to dig a tunnel out of the prisons and get captured by the Israeli government just a few days later. And currently they are experiencing a lot of torture at the hands of the Israeli government for them trying to escape to freedom. So I would say that there's been a lot of campaigns left and right about freeing Palestinian people, especially those that were held on political assumptions or for being activists, calling for the freedom of their own people.
And that again is being covered by HR 2590, the torture of prisoners.
Exactly.
I have another question here in regards to the youth movement. It seems that they're mobilizing to a degree that the world hasn't seen in decades. And I don't know if you can comment anything in that regard.
About the youth movement? Is that what?
Yeah. In fact, the Palestinian youth and the youth movement in general.
Yeah, I think I do agree with that in many ways. And I really think that's because internationally we've been more interconnected than ever before. In the past, where we primarily relied on television broadcasting to get us information, to moving to access to the internet, and now moving to this whole entire frenzy around social media activism, which has been largely fruitful for many causes around the world that would have actually been swept under the rug if it was not for the ability of individuals like ourselves that are able to post about what's going on and then build a movement around that of people reposting it and utilizing their spheres of influence. So I think, yes, there is a huge level of engagement of younger generations for the sheer fact that they are higher consumers of social media. And they're using that level of consumerism to really drive the issues that are deeply personal to them, and that they would like to see change for, and how to organize around it.
Yeah. Did you by any chance hear Mahmoud Abbas in his address to the United Nations? I wonder if we get a chance to do that. I don't know if you did a few days ago.
I have not. I was engaging in a bit of self-care the last couple of days and taking advantage of the changing of the leaves in Colorado. So, but please do share about that. I actually am going to go hang out with my dad after this, and so we usually hash out Palestinian politics together. So, talk to me tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, no, I was wondering if, I mean, I thought that what he said was on the money, very accurate, and just wondering if there was anything that you saw like missing in regards to inviting or invoking the help of the international community towards getting out of this stalemate. It's
Yeah. I'm always cautious about the Palestinian National Authority's like efforts to invoke international support because one, yes, we should invoke it and we should call on it. But the problem is every time we try to engage in it, the Israeli government claps back on us in some way that ultimately cripples us to the point that we have to disengage. For example, every time we've been trying to go to the International Criminal Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, the Israeli government has done something, right? It's either released sewage on Gazans and they had an increased cholera outbreak. They've upheld some of the economy for the Palestinian people, given the way that the Israeli government does control part of the Palestinian economy as well. And so they ultimately put us in a tight position where they can cripple us to the point that we say, okay, fine, never mind, we're not going to do this anymore. So I support the need to engage international actors and state actors in order to move the very things that we want. But I just think that it has not worked as a very good tactic because the Israeli government has clapped back on disenfranchising Palestinians even more when they do that. So we end up not being able to follow through because of the sheer fact that we need to make sure at least some sort of survival can be guaranteed for our people.
well, speaking of survival, what do you think of annexation?
Annexation of?
Well, it seems that there is a de facto annexation in the West Bank. Area C, over 60% is in full control of the Israeli military, and people are being driven towards the suburban areas, so that there is essentially a number of Bantustans that are accumulating. And so this area C that Israel wants to control, there was talk about potential annexation. And if we go back to 67 and we look at what happened to East Jerusalem in regards to annexation, I don't know whether the same footprint might be followed in regards to the West Bank.
That is that's a very big question, because one of the reasons why I also fixate a lot on Israeli settlements is because the Israeli government uses Israeli settlements as a means to change the facts on the ground, as they say. They ultimately build these settlements in order to move the Israeli population into that space, which, let's be very clear, it's only Israeli Jews that can live in these illegal settlements. And I call them illegal because they're all within the West Bank, which was after the Oslo Accords. Yes, the Oslo Accords divided A, B, and C, but it was with a plan that within 5 years, the Palestinian government would have full sovereignty and be able to be its own nation state. And so the reason why I bring that up is because, for example, now we're seeing settlements that like maybe 20 years ago were like barely a couple of thousand people now have several hundreds of thousands of people. And so now what the Israeli government is saying is like, hey, we can't displace hundreds of thousands of people after them living there for a couple of generations. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this land and consider it part of the Israeli government as part of their bargaining chips. But we'll give you this other land over here that's in Area C to you all. And so they kind of like want to pick and choose and change all of it. My thing is this idea of annexation is a very complex one. And I think where the complexity really lies in is in the fact that the Israeli government wants to maintain a Jewish majority, right? So if they're going to be annexing parts of the West Bank, what are they going to do with the people that live there, right? And so my thing is, like, you can't get rid of the Palestinians. You can't push them out to other countries like you did in the past, because those countries are not going to accept them. Not to mention that's a massive exodus of millions of people. The other thing is you can't annex them and consider them part of your Israeli population, because at that point they might outnumber your Jewish majority that you're aiming to have. And so for me, I think annexation is used as a lot of political term in order to drive Israeli voters to vote in a particular way. I just don't know about the reality of it really happening, knowing that the Israeli government is fixated on maintaining a Jewish majority, and any type of annexation would mean that they would be pushing in a Palestinian population into what they would be considering Israel. That would not be conducive to what their goal is as a nation.
Yeah, unless, of course, they annex what is already depopulated in Area C, for the last 20
Exactly.
years.
So they will aim to depopulate in hopes of capturing bits of it. But I don't know. It's a very sensitive topic, to say the least, and it's very difficult to see how it plays out. And the thing that bothers me out of all of it is that they're just picking and choosing what lands they want as if there was nobody there. And that's the one thing that I will never understand about this quest for Israeli sovereignty, which literally almost seems like to be acting as if they found this like empty land and there was nobody there. We say in a lot of Palestinian spaces that which literally means that you took our country furnished. We had airports, we had houses, everything of us, or you've just simply taken them, displaced the population, relabeled the very cities of who we were, and made it into the state that you wanted to establish. And so it's a very difficult topic, and it's a very frustrating topic, to say the least.
Exactly. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time, and we are actually past 3 minutes after 8. So, and I'm sorry if there's a number of questions we cannot get to, but I sure would like to thank you for very enlightening point of view and knowledge and experience in this. And with this, I will just turn it back to Jennifer. Thanks again for your participation.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Thank you, Nadeen. This is wonderful. We really appreciate all of your insight into policy that goes on and different measures of activism that people can take. So again, we wanted to invite our viewers to check out our website, check out our newsletter, and hopefully consider supporting the women's market in Beit Umar. And then we'll be sure to send out notice of our next interview. It'll be probably in about a month or so. And we thank everyone for joining us. Have a good evening or day, depending on where you are in the world. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.